What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 214. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined by co-host Connor Freeman today. Connor, how you doing?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you?
Good. Happy to have you back on the show, Connor. And we got more Iran news this week, updates on the U.S. Russia talks, and Korea news, Gitmo news. A lot of important stuff on today's show. Be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of my work. Connor is one of our writers at the Institute, and you can find all of his works at the featured articles section there. And also check out the news roundup. Subscribe to the show somewhere, whether that's on YouTube, Rumble, Odysee for the video version. You like just the audio version, it's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. So you really like foreign policy news, you want to get this show and the Scott Horton show all in one feed, you could do that there. Let's see. And then just mention that you could donate to the show. We got people that are, subscribed at Patreon or Subscribestar. Great ways to set up recurring donations there. You could also drop us crypto. That information is all in the show notes page. Or another way you could help the show, and a lot of people kind of already use CBD, especially in the libertarian community and among our audience. They were early people on board with CBD, and and so we got Paloma Verde. You get a 25% discount when you use our promo code PEACE. You do have to spend $75, but the show gets a financial kickback. And so if you're ever wondering, how can I help out the show, how can I help those guys to get better equipment and continue to do this, one way could be, you already use CBD, go to Paloma Verde and do your shopping there. Connor, I know you like the Paloma Verde products. Tell me what you like from there.
Yeah, I am a huge fan of the soft gels. I just got some more, and Carlos sent me some of the gummy bears, and then some of the soft gels that have curcumin, and then also some of the ointment that you can apply to your back, the topical stuff, and or wherever you're feeling pain. And I was just getting over it. It may or may not have been COVID. I don't think it was, but whatever it was, I was feeling a lot of inflammation in my back and elsewhere. And I took just one dose, the 25 milligrams of the soft gel, and it knocked it out instantly. Had an extra gummy bear too because they're awesome. But I've been using CBD for years and years. Out here in Arizona, we have legal weed. And before then, I was checking out all the different dispensaries. So I've been using different brands of CBD for years, and there's nobody that competes with Paloma Verde. So definitely check it out, and you're supporting the show too.
All right. Again, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE, all the information in the show notes pages, which is, of course, at the Libertarian Institute. Connor, let's get into the show. We're going to start off today talking about what's going on with Iran. Talks, most people this week are focused on the talks between the U.S. and Russia in Vienna, but that doesn't mean that there's not things going on between the U.S. and Iran and different important rhetoric. And so what's happening here, Connor?
Well, picking up where we left off, I think basically we've got some good news. So one thing I'll point out is that I don't know why, but as we've discussed before, this idea, I don't know if I guess I first heard about the interim deal concept when Sullivan was talking with his Israeli counterpart, El Hulada. And they have that working group, the U.S. Israel working group, and they're often discussing Iran. It's a more recent iteration of a group that existed, during previous administrations. But regardless, I mean, they were talking about how they could do, I think they called it a freeze for freeze. Basically, the idea was they were trying to give Iran less than they were asking for, a much significantly less. I mean, it was an insult almost, because they would be like, well, if you stop enriching uranium to 60%, we'll provide some waivers for humanitarian aid or something like that. Which in practice those are never effective anyway. There have been study after study from whether it's the United the World Health Organization or Human Rights Watch. I've cited in previous articles where they'll tell you that no, the banks, businesses, medical companies, everybody is scared away from by the sanctions and the threat of sanctions. Nobody wants to get anywhere near Iran. It's caused massive problems for the population and horrible medical shortages and all kinds of things. So that was a ridiculous idea in the first place. And of course, Israel was against it from the get-go because they said it would embolden the hardliners. But in Iran. But yeah, so the Iranians have said that no, we're not going to do that because there's no way we would be able to get the verification mechanisms and the sanctions relief that we're insisting on. So the idea of an interim deal is out of the question. So I don't know why, but somebody must have proposed this as like a last-ditch effort because the Iranians have had the upper hand for the last couple of weeks, particularly since the seventh round of negotiations. We're still in the eighth round at this point in Vienna. And basically, they're negotiating on Iran's terms now on their draft proposals that they had put forward at the beginning, at the onset when talks resumed in November. And basically, they're demanding a full implementation of the original deal, which even Obama did not do. When the deal was signed on the same day, the Americans imposed new sanctions on Iran. So yeah, so Saeed Khatizbeh, the foreign ministry spokesman, is quoted in Bloomberg saying that, quote, the U.S. return to the nuclear deal should come with necessary assurances and verifications, and a chain of sanctions must be lifted. It cannot happen through an interim deal. So that's off the table. Now, we also have some more good news because the French, who have previously been throwing cold water on things and saying, I believe some of their quotes, a lot of these are kind of their sort of variations on each other, but I think the same foreign minister had come out and previously said things like, the JCPOA is being hollowed out and the substance is gone and there's not going to be anything to negotiate left. But now the French foreign minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, says, I remain convinced we can reach a deal. Bits of progress have been made in the last few days. We have been heading in a positive direction. But time is of the essence because if we don't get an accord quickly, there will be nothing to negotiate. So certainly an improvement on the rhetoric. He said we're on a rather positive path elsewhere. We also have the Russian envoy saying on Twitter that all participants now, quote, recognize that some progress is being made towards an agreement on the restoration of the JCPOA and sanctions lifting. Now, the Iranian foreign minister gave a interview to Al Jazeera where he said that the talks, that a deal is possible, a good deal. Believe he says in other interviews that we're headed towards a good deal. We've been hearing things like this a lot from various people involved in the talks. Like, for instance, previously we talked on the show about how Enrique Mora, the EU coordinator of the talks in Vienna, had said we're in exactly the right place to be if we want a successful resolution. And so now Hussein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, is saying he's clarifying the demands of the Iranians, which, as we've been, it's basically what we've been saying here all along, that they're saying, quote, lifting sanctions means lifting all forms of sanctions stipulated in the nuclear agreement. And the sanctions that Trump reimposed that contradict the terms of the agreement should be lifted as well. So they say we demand guarantees that include not imposing any new sanctions and not reimposing sanctions after lifting them under any pretext. He said he's hearing good words from the U.S., but is yet to see serious actions. So, and of course, this is after, as we discussed last week, I believe, that Ned Price had come out and said, as I was sort of predicting that, I was predicting that we were getting to a point where they were going to have to start changing their tune because the Iranians weren't going to back down and were sticking with their demands and being steadfast and actually, like I said, gaining the upper hand. We had Ned Price come out, and for the first time, the Americans said something positive. They said, we're making modest progress. So that's a good sign. There was another interview in the New Arab or another report that said that the Iranian foreign minister says they're approaching a good agreement, but it depends on the other parties involved. He says the initiatives of the Iranian side and the negotiations that have taken place have put us on the right track. We're close to a good agreement, but to reach this good agreement in the short term, it has to be pursued by the other side. He says the Islamic Republic is not looking to drag out negotiations. but it's important for them to defend the rights and interests of the country. And this was interesting. He was talking about the Americans and the Europeans like they were children, and like they're no longer at all impressed with the strong arm tactics, which are inevitably proven to be basically all surface and no substance. So he goes, excuse me. He goes, yesterday France played the role of bad cop, but today they're behaving reasonably. And then another quote was, yesterday the American side had unacceptable demands, but today we believe they've adapted to the realities of the situation. He says, at the end of the day, a good deal is an agreement that satisfies all parties. So at this point, it looks to me like we're getting closer and closer to a resolution and to reach an agreement, because basically I mean, even the Israelis there's more and more indications that even the Israelis are adapting to the new realities. For instance, we had the chief of military intelligence come out recently and say that they are that it would be better for Israel for a deal to be reached in Vienna, as opposed to having the deal collapse. And Ben Armbruster here at Responsible Statecraft notes that there's a growing chorus of former and current Israeli security officials who are saying that actually Netanyahu's policy of pushing Trump to leave the deal was actually a big mistake. And they point to Iran's expansion of their nuclear program as one of the chief reasons for it being such a disaster. Now, what's ironic about that, of course, is, I mean, the Iranians waited a year before they expanded their nuclear program outside the restrictions written in the written word of the deal. So, and then of course, once they really started to ramp things up in the cases of, say, 20% enrichment of uranium, or in the most extreme case, the 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride, that was which is done in small amounts. And as we pointed out here, they have essentially no use for that except to make the point and to discourage further Israeli sabotage and American sanctions. So even after Trump pulled out of the deal, it took all these extra Israeli attacks in order for Iran to even expand their program to the extent that they did, to bring the Americans back to the table. So it's been more than just pushing the Americans to leave the deal that's been a disaster. But I also have to laugh because when you look at it from our perspective, it's not really. I mean, Iran is not really a threat to Israel, so to speak, unless they actually start the war. That the thing about the JCPOA is it's necessary to take war off the table, but it's obviously not necessary to contain Iran's supposed nuclear ambitions, which of course they're already a signatory of the NPT, and for decades we've known for sure, it's confirmed that they're not seeking nuclear weapons. They don't have a nuclear weapons program. And so it's
just a highlight there, Connor. What you're saying is the JCPOA guarantees that the U.S. and Israel cannot have an excuse to start an aggressive war against Iran on the pretext of nuclear weapons, because the IAEA, the UN's nuclear weapons watchdog, is there to certify and say they're absolutely not making nukes. And so that made sure that there's really no cause for war, right? Short of Iran making nuclear weapons, Israel and the U.S. I don't think would have the cause to launch an aggressive attack. And so that's really one of the points of the JCPOA, because Iran was never making nuclear weapons. And one of the reasons they agreed to it was I think because even though they'll put additional restrictions on their program, it did guarantee that there would be an organization showing that they're not making nukes. So what else do we have here about Iran deal stuff, Connor?
Yeah, I'll also point out that well, before we move on, I'll just point out that Yair Lapid was also saying in the same meeting that if the deal is reached, Israel should refrain from attacking the Biden administration publicly, because, as he says, it could seriously damage the relationship with the administration. And as Dave Decamp points out, that Haliva, the chief of the military intelligence um, program, was saying that, or the military intelligence agency was saying that he was talking with David Barnea, the head of the Mossad, who was saying that he still is opposed to the deal and that he believes they still have time to influence Washington on the talks. Now, we'll just continue with Israel, and then we're going to move on to some other things about regional diplomacy that Iran is doing, and kind of U.S. public opinion. But as long as we're talking about Israel, Naftali Bennett, who previously was toning down his rhetoric and saying things like, we would accept a good deal, and this kind of thing, but it needs to be stronger. There needs to be more pressure put on Iran, which was certainly a step down from what he and his administration was saying previously about basically encouraging the Americans to just abandon diplomacy, impose new sanctions, and credibly threaten to attack Iran. But now he's back to saying things to Parliament about how he's talking up Israel has a military budget now that's nearly $20 billion. He says that they've increased it greatly in order to prepare for a military attack on Iran, echoing the rhetoric of, Aviv Kohavi, who's been saying all last year that they're accelerating plans to attack Iran, and that as the Israeli government has previously announced that they've put billions of dollars into the budget, increased the military budget by billions of dollars in order to prepare specifically to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, and they restarted drills to practice for that. But as Jason Ditz says here at antiwar.com, he just points out that, the truth is they've been threatening this for decades. Of course, it's a way to pressure the U.S. to get them to act on Israel's behalf. Here instead of a real genuine threat to just go it alone and start this war unilaterally, which more and more Israeli military officials are admitting that they don't have the capability to do that. They lack the bunker buster bombs. They lack planes that can carry the bunker buster bombs. They don't have the right refueling tankers, and they're years away from acquiring them, as the Americans have told them, even though they've requested that they be expedited and that sort of thing. But yeah, and as Jason makes a point that you were making as well, which is that that in reality, once the deal is in place, which is why they always were against it in the first place, I think, because it takes the threat and the excuse for them to get more aid and to maintain their hegemony in the region. Once it's everybody agrees and it's obvious to everyone that Iran is not seeking nukes, and that the IAEA is constantly and as they still are, reaffirming Iran's compliance with the deal. Then it really puts Israel in the position of being, clearly an aggressor who's, a kind of a menace, essentially a menace to stability in the region. Bennett also was saying that he said to the parliament, he was saying, in regard to the nuclear talks in Vienna, we are definitely concerned. Israel is not a party to the agreements. He said they're not bound by what will be written in the agreements. If they are signed, Israel will continue to maintain full freedom of action anywhere, anytime, with no constraints. So just more threats. We also know that Blinken held a call with Yair Lapid to discuss Iran. The State Department said that they were discussing the challenges posed by Iran, and Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister, said on Twitter that he and Blinken discussed, quote, the importance of putting pressure on Iran. All right. So now there's some interesting polling that came out at the beginning of this week from a group called Morning Consult. And they discovered some interesting things about American public opinion on returning to the Iran deal. So one thing that is, So one thing that's very interesting is that they were so the way the questions are framed, there's a great piece I recommend people read on Daniel Larison's Substack about, excuse me, about the way the questions are framed. One of the things that they ask most Americans here in this poll is, would you support dropping sanctions, the Americans dropping their sanctions on Iran, if it would bring Iran to the negotiating table? Which is, we're in the 8th round of negotiations in Vienna. it's almost like this question should have been asked at the latest last year during the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which, frankly, Iran made a huge concession, and the Americans have not reciprocated at all when you consider the fact that, the Iranians said they would not come to the table in the midst of this maximum pressure campaign in the absence of sanctions relief. And why would they? But when Biden came in, because they believed that the Democrats actually supported the deal, they naively thought that Biden would be, was serious when he was talking about how he wanted to return to the deal. And they thought that they would want to, recover Trump's killing essentially of Obama's main foreign policy achievement, namely the JCPOA. And that turned out not to be true. And so Daniel Larison points out here that it would have been better if they had asked the Americans, how do you feel about the fact that that the Biden administration has not lifted any sanctions? Because obviously talks have been ongoing. But yeah, so there is a plurality support for that weird question. 42% of Americans apparently support sanctions relief if it spurs negotiations. We also find out that 28% of 56% of all U.S. voters support returning to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. That includes 72% of Democrats, 52% of independents, and 43% of Republicans, if you can believe it. Only 39% of Republicans oppose the deal. There's the proportion of people who say that they don't know or have no opinion is smaller than you would think. On all those categories of all U.S. voters, Democrats, independents, and Republicans, it ranges from 15 to 22% in those different categories. And even with Republicans, it's less than 20% of those who don't know. And like I said, I was surprised that 43% support returning to the deal. But there's other weird, incongruencies in the data. Like 28% of the voters said that they don't they doubt that the nuclear deal would prevent Iran from manufacturing nuclear weapons. And apparently 51% of those polled are concerned about Iran seeking nuclear weapons or Iran building nuclear weapons. What was really ironic about that is only 5% said that they're not at all concerned about Iran developing nuclear weapons. 8% said they're not very concerned. 10% said they didn't know. But as Daniel points out, the 40% overall think Trump was wrong to withdraw from the deal. But 51% don't expect the agreement to actually prevent Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons. 43% of Republicans support it, but only 14% think Trump was wrong to withdraw. So as he hypothesizes, presumably some of these people are supporters that don't really support the agreement, but they say they do because they want to seem reasonable. But I like the point that he makes here, too, about how after 6 years of hawkish neoconservative propaganda and lies about Iran seeking nuclear weapons, I mean, it's longer than that. I've been hearing that since I was making memories, especially in the War on Terror era, the big Iranian boogeyman. But he also makes a point that the Democratic defenses of the deal always come with these caveats that while the deal is flawed and these kinds of things, because I think in a lot of ways, as we were describing how the deal isn't necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring these weapons, it's difficult. I mean, they don't really spin it to the general public, even when they're acting like they're talking it up as one of Obama's, main achievements. They won't talk about it as if it's like, it took unless it's like Trita Parsi or somebody saying that they took war off the neocons' war off the table or Israel's war off the table. It has to be in the guise of, Iran, this worst state sponsor of terror. We were able to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons and contain Iran. And it's sort of painted in this. So in order to talk up the achievement, you have to artificially inflate the threat in a lot of ways. So And they'll talk about, still hear Democrats saying that, while we didn't, we'd still like to have the longer, stronger deal and do something about Iran's, alliances in the region and their ballistic missiles and this sort of thing. Now, the worst part of the data is, as Daniel points out, that they asked them what would they support policies Americans would support if negotiations in Vienna fail, and 65% supported increased sanctions, 50% support covert military operations. They don't ask about an air war, but alarmingly 36% supported a theoretical ground intervention. And as Daniel says, luckily no one is talking about invading Iran right now, but opposition to something that insane is not nearly as high as it needs to be, which that's pretty crazy. Now, obviously, this is just one poll, but we've discussed previously other data that shows that Americans are depressingly misinformed on the situation vis-a-vis, who has nukes in the Middle East, Israel or Iran. Most Americans believe that Iran, I believe, have nuclear weapons. It's been a while since I looked at exactly the data. I put it in some of my articles, but it's a very, very small minority of Americans are aware that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. And as we saw earlier, only 5% are not concerned about it. I mean, more than half country of those people polled, 51% say that they're concerned about that as like a real national security issue. Last thing before we move on from Iran, I'll just point out that the Iranians have sanctioned 52 Americans for their role in the assassination of Soleimani around the time of the anniversary, chiefly U.S. military personnel, generals, and commanders in the vicinity, as Jason Ditz reports here. And Jake Sullivan came out and responded to this, saying that Iran will face severe consequences if they act against any of the sanctioned Americans. So basically, America has the right to go around illegally assassinating Iranian officials. But if Iran threatens to, it's entirely symbolic. I mean, what are they going to do? Freeze some Mackenzie's assets in Iran? Or some American general that's they don't have any assets in Iran, of course. So it's just it's symbolic. But of course, Sullivan took the opportunity to threaten them with, it's ambiguous, but it's a threat nonetheless. Now, the last thing I'll point out is now there's news coming out. There's this report in Al Jazeera that Hussein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, just visited Qatar today to meet with Amir Sheikh Tahim bin Ahmad Al Thani and the foreign minister Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani. And they discussed the latest developments in Vienna. They discussed ways of improving bilateral relations. They said it was a priority of both countries. And they said they're ready to boost ties across the region in bilateral or multilateral formats. So this is sort of continuing Iran's efforts and also the broader regional efforts of many countries, as we've been talking here. And Trita Parsi talks about a lot as well, that as they anticipate an American withdrawal from the region and the Americans will be more increasingly focused on China. And of course, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that a lot of these longtime adversaries are now talking to each other and trying to, boost relations economically and otherwise to make war less likely, especially when you don't have the American hegemon around where you can just get them to do their dirty work for you. Let's see. So what else? So they also, Amir Abdollahian also went to Oman and was in Muscat on Monday, meeting with Fahd bin Mahmoud Al Said, long-serving deputy to the Sultan of Oman. They discussed bilateral, regional, international issues. They talked about what's going on in Vienna. Amir Abdollahian said Iran has proposed practical solutions, and they're serious about reaching an agreement. And he also said that Oman is a major priority in Raisi's foreign policy of developing, greater ties with regional neighbors, and that they would like to cultivate political, economic, and cultural relations. And they also discussed Yemen and said that they would like to see an end to the war and that it's going to take Yemeni negotiations and diplomacy for that to be achieved. But that's they also say in the report that a fifth round of talks between Riyadh and Tehran is coming up soon as well, although this doesn't provide a specific date.
All right, Connor. Great breakdown on all the Iran stuff. Let's move on. Talk about the Russia talks now. On the last show, I kind of tried to set up for what I thought was happening going into the talks, where there have been some positive signs in the past month. Something that I had in fact missed was pointed out in a great Ray McGovern article we're running today, probably yesterday for most people listening to this, at antiwar.com. So go check out Ray McGovern's latest, where he's saying that, like, hey, on December 7th and December 30th, the Biden administration or Biden himself put out to Putin and got positive responses on some missile agreements that they can make. And so it's important to see this in the context of Putin removing 10,000 troops from the Ukrainian border. And Ray even goes as far to argue that, this could really be a sign that we're going to see a drawdown in forces around Ukraine in days to come. And so there's a great article on that. I just want to add that to my analysis. But to say that, when we put this up on the last show, a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the American side was that a lot of the Russian positions are non-starters, particularly on Ukraine. And we also had Blinken saying, this happened after the last show, but before the talks started, that the U.S. and NATO rejected Russia's call for a halt of eastward expansion. And so here they just are straight up putting out that, like, even though it's a major security concern of Russia, whether Ukraine joins NATO or not, that they're not even going to consider it, whether they would actually, make an official statement and have an official policy that would be, Ukraine not joining NATO. The rhetoric from the NATO side, from the American side, is we decide who goes into NATO and not Russia, where there might be, some truth to that. Like, we can admit Ukraine into NATO, but that is going to have severe consequences, and just straight up taking that off of the table publicly and giving Russia a security guarantee would probably make far more progress with Russia than what it seems like the Biden administration is trying to make the policy, which is kind of like a backhanded way, backdoor way, where we're going to tell Russia, we told Ukraine, a senior State Department official apparently told Ukraine that, no, you're not going to be coming into NATO. We'll tell Russia that Ukraine isn't coming into NATO at least for 10 years or whatever it is. But, that's not the same thing as a public above the board agreement. And there's been live good articles recently at antiwar.com, including by Ted Snyder and others, pointing out that, look, that Russia had these kind of, agreements between officials, backdoor before situation, like, NATO wasn't going to expand eastward, in 1999. And here we are with, NATO expanded and looking to include Ukraine and Georgia and, even talk now about Finland and Sweden joining, or things like this, is real aggression in the eyes of Russia for what NATO's doing, in a big violation of, again, an agreement from diplomat to diplomat, leader to leader situation without an official shake of hands. And so, very interesting that the U.S. is taking this off the table, which, if you're looking at it from the Russian side and what they've said leading up to the talks, this seems to be the most hardline issue they have, is on Ukrainian NATO membership. Connor, do you kind of agree with that? Or have you seen like different rhetoric that maybe the Russians are willing to be flexible on the Ukraine issue? That seems to be the one they're the most hardline on, though, to me.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've known for years that that's Russia's red line. You can't bring Ukraine into NATO. And I'm disheartened by the fact that, like you said, when I think we all breathed a sigh of relief when we saw that report. Did you say it was in the AP, the one from was the last month, when they said essentially that they had told Ukraine that it's not happening at least for 10 years, if that? Yeah. So I mean, that put my mind at ease, at least temporarily. Anyway, I'm always looking for that's why I'm really enjoying reading Ray McGovern right now, because, if you read Gilbert Doctorow or Scott Ritter and other experts, they'll tell you that it's kind of or even Doug McGregor was just talking to Aaron Mate, saying that it's inevitable that that the Americans are essentially not going to budge, and that the Russians will have to back up their demands with some sort of now it's possible that they could put hypersonics or some kind of missiles in that reinstitute mutually assured destruction out inside in like international waters where they could say theoretically hit DC in like 5 minutes or something like that. And I mean that would be I mean that's kind of the problem because because the Americans have torn up the anti-ballistic missile treaty and then the INF treaty and then open skies and then put these so-called anti-ballistic missile sites in Romania and Poland that can be turned into offensive weapons very easily that essentially neutralize, or the aim is anyway to neutralize Russia's retaliatory capabilities and cancel out the fantasy is that they can cancel out their mutually the I guess they can cancel out mutually assured destruction and have that first strike capability, which obviously destabilizes the whole region. So and the whole world. So Russia will have to do something at some point to get the Americans to stop this, constant encroachment. I mean, they're talking about putting offensive missiles in Ukraine, and so that it does appear to be something, at least according to the Russians. I think it was Yuri Ushakov, Putin's top aide or top foreign policy aide, who Ray was quoting, going to Russian media immediately after their phone call on the 30th and saying that he's agreed that they're not going to do that. They're not going to put offensive missiles, the likes of which could be put into those ABM sites in Romania and Poland, in Ukraine. They've also, now we're hearing from Wendy Sherman that they're talking about reviving the INF treaty and limiting the size and scope of these military exercises on both sides. Although, I mean, obviously, the NATO exercises are more obviously more constant and frankly larger. If you look at like Pat McFarland has a terrific piece. Our friend, I think it's called "The Dangers of Great Power Competition with Russia and China," which outlines how this year, or last year, I should say, we're seeing the largest military exercises since the Cold War. Chief, the big umbrella drill that had a bunch of other ancillaries was Defender Europe 21. This is all in Eastern Europe, right on Russia's borders. You had German and American tanks, I think it was in Latvia, racing each other, near Russia's border. So it's crazy the kind of stuff that they do. The constant flyovers in the Black Sea and sending warships, always a constant deployments of warships and warplanes into the Black Sea. So Russia has a lot of things that they want to be put onto the table. It's interesting that the Americans are making concessions that I frankly didn't expect. And then kind of, like you said, doing this about face on the Ukraine issue. I'm hoping that a lot of that is for domestic consumption. I hope that the Russians, I'm inclined to want to lean toward Ray's perspective, which is that this mainstream media spin about it being an impasse and that the Russians aren't getting anything of what they wanted are hopefully not true. And, it does sound like the way Ray describes it and the way it's been talked about by the Russians is that Putin and Biden are directly managing these talks and that they appointed the experts, the interlocutors themselves. So that's a good sign because it seems like Biden and Putin are, when they talk with each other, are able to move much further along than if you had Blinken or Sullivan, God forbid, in charge of these talks. But then you see things like you said, or like we were talking before. Sullivan is talking with like Trump administration hawks on Russia and looking for advice from them on how to deal with Moscow. Ukraine, I'm sorry, I know I went off on a tangent, but Ukraine definitely is the red line. So I don't see how they can pull this stuff unless it's just rhetoric to say like, hey, any country has a right to join NATO if they want, when in reality they don't. And we know that because of what happened in Georgia in 2008. And also if you look at what happened with Crimea is historically Russian territory, of course, but the Americans have proven that they're not willing to fight a war over Ukraine or Georgia. So this is, I think, mostly just bluster to sell weapons and to create tensions. And I think the Russians know that. So I'm hoping that, like the Iranians, the Russians know that they have the upper hand here in these talks. And I don't realistically see the Americans crossing the Ukraine red line.
Yeah. So I guess, getting back to like where we were on the talks, I want to point out there were initial talks that happened at a dinner on January 9th. And the Russians refer to these talks as complex and business-like, which is rhetoric that they've been using around talks, including the 30th call with Biden and Putin. They called those business-like as well. But in the positive note, they said the Russian deputy foreign minister said, "I do not think we'll waste time in vain tomorrow." And so that was to me seeming to be a good sign. In the Reuters article, he said the Russian deputy foreign minister referred to the meeting as amazing, but the Reuters, I guess, author thought that it must have at least enough to mention it, that he was speaking ironically or sarcastically or something like that. Now, I want to get into the actual talks, Connor, and I want to break these down by the kind of the way it was covered through different media sources. And so this is Reuters. The piece is titled U.S. and Russia Still Pulls Apart After Ukraine Talks. And this article really highlights that the Russian deputy foreign minister who met with U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said that unfortunately we have a great disparity in our principled approach to this, referring to Ukraine. The U.S. and Russia in some ways have opposite views on what needs to be done. And again, that's talking about the Ukraine issue. And so that's really what the Reuters piece focused in on. And it's kind of interesting that, they just highlight this because there's a lot of other statements and a lot of others issue talking about. Here at Miami Herald, the article is titled U.S. Russia Talks on Ukraine End After 8 Hours Without Agreement. And so this title is just kind of unnecessary because nobody really thought they were going to come out with any kind of official agreement or anything like that, Connor. But at least it doesn't necessarily just say that, the both sides are far apart, we're at an impasse or anything like that, like a lot of the other articles did. This one highlights that the talks and kind of sums up the talks as being frank and forthright, which seems to be somewhat honest. It highlights Wendy Sherman saying we still have a long way to go, and that for Russia, the deputy foreign minister said that the Ukraine issue is one we can't back away from, and kind of confirming a little bit of what we and you were just talking about, Connor, how important that issue is and how key it is. This article, unlike the Reuters one, does mention that the U.S. was willing to talk about the placement of missiles, and particularly the INF treaty, which is extremely important. And let's see, so that's this Miami Herald article. Next, we got one from Axios titled Putin Pushes His Red Lines in Kazakhstan and Ukraine. This article tying the Kazakhstan and the Ukraine issue together, which I think is a thought of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, whether or not the U.S. actually is in any way behind what's happening in Kazakhstan, Connor. I think, and we see this in articles and like op-eds at the I think Washington Post is Josh Rogan writing that, hey, this is a really good opportunity. Putin can fight a two-front battle in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine, and so we could put pressure on Russia in Kazakhstan, and then they'll require them to have to, give more on the Ukraine issue. And so, this article ties the two together, but specifically on the talks, it said that Russia had mentioned a military technical solution to Ukraine if talks failed. Now, they didn't put a lot of other context around this statement or anything like that. So very interesting. Also said playing with fire on the Ukraine issue. And so here we have the first three articles, Connor, I highlight here, and these are representative of a lot of the mainstream media. I couldn't do this with every single, organization that wrote up a piece here, but I did want to bring up these few to point out that they are absolutely, if you just read it, most people are just going to read the headlines, but even if you read the articles, you come away very skeptical that anything good happened or positive happened at the talks at all. Now we'll get to the New York Times, which says Russia plays down threat to Ukraine after meetings with U.S. And so this article gives you almost the exact opposite view on how Russia is feeling about the Ukraine issue, because through this article they highlight Russia saying that, look, we're not going to invade Ukraine. We don't think what they say, we're not there is no reason to fear some kind of escalatory scenario. And so they're and also saying the talks were professional, long, difficult, deep, concrete, without attempts to gloss over some sharp edges. And so I think this kind of matches something that Wendy Sherman said, which is again pointed out in this New York Times article, which is that the real purpose of these means, oh, actually, excuse me, this is let's move on. I think the best write-up, actually, Connor, wasn't the New York Times, but was actually this one from War is Boring, which tends to be hawkish, but this titled U.S. offers Russia changes to its troop deployments to defuse Ukraine crisis. And while I'm not sure that the U.S. offer on, war games and things like that, missile deployments, as Ray was talking about, is actually enough to diffuse the Ukraine situation, this does highlight that was, kind of the proposal that the U.S. was putting forward. And so these weren't dead-end talks where the U.S. came with absolutely nothing. Now, Wendy Sherman pointed out that this wasn't meant to be a negotiation, but rather an opportunity for both sides to sit down and make their positions clear to the other side. Now, I don't know, Connor. I don't think me or you would really have to talk to the Russian deputy foreign minister for 8 hours to understand the Ukrainian position or the Russian position on Ukraine. But if that's what it took to get through the Biden administration's heads, then, maybe that's what it will take. So just whenever whenever there's a major story like this, how it's covered in different areas of them in the news section. We're not talking about the op-ed writers or the editorial boards for these different papers and having different conservative or liberal biases. This is just the information. And to point out, as Ray does, and the real thesis of his article is that the media is completely ignoring any positive developments and simply focusing on the negative ones. One that I wanted to bring up that I don't think Ray mentions in his article, but pre and post December 25th, with Russia moving 10,000 troops away from the border, they continue to just say there's around 100,000 Russian troops near the Ukrainian border. Now, I guess 90,000 is around 100,000, right? And so it's not like I could technically be like, oh, this is a major violation of the English language or anything like that. But it's very distinct that if you're a reader of like the Washington Post or the New York Times or Reuters or the AP, and you don't look at antiwar.com, you're just going to continue to read, oh, there's 100,000 troops there, there's 100,000 troops there, but there's actually 10,000 troops less. And that's extremely important that the US is claiming that Russia is in the middle of a massive military buildup, when actually their most recent troop movements were to move troops away from the border. And that just doesn't come through in any of these articles. And wanted to highlight that. So
yeah, I'll just say really quick, Moon of Alabama pointed out that after they took those 10,000 troops away from the border, as it's putatively referred to as away from the border, though they could be like 100 miles away from the border anyway, but like he said, it goes, if you look at that Washington Post piece, when they provided the U.S. intelligence and they said that we expect they could do like an invasion of 175,000 troops, they go, but the U.S. map, according to the intelligence, said at that time, and I think this was in early December, where they said it's 70,000 troops. So if they took 10,000 off of that, then it's 60,000 troops or so. And I was reading this letter that was referenced in that piece about Sullivan meeting with the Hawks. They talk about this piece from I think it's the Eurasia Center, that's signed by Wesley Clark and Strobe Talbot and Mike, I think,
Michael Mitfall.
right. And they say in there, they should provide Stinger missiles and I think more Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine and basically escalate. And one of the things that they say in there, if you click the link, the first thing they say in this letter is that what did they say? They said, if you might want to click the link. I'm pretty sure they say, or I'll find out really quick, but they say basically after the call with Putin on the 30th, troop levels increased. If you look at the first, right after that editor's note, they say something about, like, right in the beginning, they say that troop levels are increasing.
Yeah, well, since the call on December 7th, and so I guess, that just leaves out the current context and everything like that. It may have been, I guess, true between the 7th and the 25th that troop numbers went out, but it's a very interesting point. And, just to go back to the point of that article, Connor, was that, Jade Sullivan is talking to these people. And you know what? Like, if, let's say, we have great, like, Dave Smith is the president or something like that, and Scott Horton is the national security advisor, right? And the Hawks are meeting with him, and he tells the Hawks, like, yeah, I hear ya. All of your concerns are, we're dealing with it. Nothing to worry about, guys. And then immediately leaves the room and goes, just wait until these losers find out what we're actually planning. That would be one thing. But when these people say, we talked to Jade Sullivan and we feel pretty confident, Jade Sullivan is their friend, right? That's the reason he's meeting with them. It isn't because, he's the NSA and they're former high-ranking officials. There's a lot of high-ranking officials out there. Not all of them gets meetings with the National Security Advisor. They get it with Jade Sullivan because they're looking to move him, and the fact that they feel comfortable with Jade Sullivan's position is concerning to me because these people are absolutely lunatics when it comes to Russia. Now, another Russian lunatic a lunatic on Russia is Ted Cruz, who's been holding up all kinds of ambassadorship nominations. And look, there's plenty of reasons to complain about who the Biden administration is appointing in all these places. They, I think, put like this person, Meg Whitman, in Kenya, who's more of a businesswoman than an actual, like, diplomat. And, this is a Horn of Africa country that's kind of important to probably have, like, a real ass diplomat there. But, Ted Cruz is just holding them up because he didn't get his way on the NDAA that already passed, where he wanted to vote on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline there. So eventually he cuts a deal with Democratic leadership where he's going to let them, have the votes on the ambassadors, and in exchange, he's going to get a vote on possibly sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is absolutely crazy. It's a pipeline between Russia and Germany, and the Germans don't want to sanction it. And so if that's the case, then the U.S. obviously shouldn't want to sanction our NATO treaty ally over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But that's what Ted Cruz wants to do. Now, Rand Paul doesn't directly call out Ted Cruz in this article, but he does make the point that this really isn't about security, Connor, and likely the real purpose here is that there are people in the Congress that are there because they are represent states with huge amounts of, natural gas and all these other things. And this is just mercantilism, right? The reason that they want to prevent, trade between Germany and Russia through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is because American natural gas manufacturers will make more money if that pipeline doesn't exist. Rand also points out, makes good arguments against sanctions here, but him taking a shot at Ted Cruz I think is very important. Before we wrap up the discussion here on Russia, Connor, I did want to talk about Kazakhstan briefly. I went into, and I think I did a pretty thorough breakdown breakdown on the last show, so we don't have to get into a ton of detail here. But I just wanted to mention that the Kazakhstan leader is now saying that the Russian-led security troops, these are from the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's not like some people will call it Russian NATO. I don't think it's really Russian NATO. It's a Russian security agreement. I don't think it's quite as strong or anything like that. But, when there was what is being described by the Kazakhstan leadership as a coup attempt in the country, they did get a deployment of 2,000 troops from Russia and other CSTO countries. And so they now say that those protests have been quelled and they're leaving. I think I read today 8,000 arrests, and then I think right before the show I heard a 10,000 actually arrests that they made it throughout Kazakhstan. It's a huge country. For people who maybe don't know exactly where it is, if you just the map in your head, there's like these two big countries that exist between Russia and China. One's Mongolia, the other one is Kazakhstan. And so this is a huge country, right? And it's landlocked. It has nothing at all. It seems to be even maybe more than Afghanistan, the furthest place on earth from the United States, but yet the U.S. is complaining about Russian troops deploying there and everything like that. And while we could go into and get into like Antony Blinken's hypocrisy on this, Connor, I guess we'll have to leave that for another show. The last thing I have on this issue was that China is also offering support to Kazakhstan, specifically saying that they're concerned about the U.S. involvement and potential interference in Kazakhstan is one of the reasons that they're offering support. So anything else on this, Connor? Anything I missed that you want to mention?
No, not at the moment, except that no, this is there's a great piece by I think his name is pronounced Anatol Lievin over at Responsible Statecraft that you ran at antiwar.com today, where he talks about how the Kazakhstan, like you said, it's huge. It's 3 times the size of Texas, but it shares more than 1,000-mile border with Xinjiang province. And of course, it plays a huge role in the Belt and Road Initiative. I think Dan McAdams was recently on Scott Horton's show talking about how actually the Belt and Road Initiative was announced at a major university named after more or less the supreme ruler of Kazakhstan. And there's a large Kazakh population in Xinjiang, and it's caused some kind of, there's solidarity felt in Kazakhstan. So it's created some pressure on the government there in terms of their dealings with China. So he also talks about how that could be kind of a powder keg, and how the U.S., if they do choose to get involved, could exploit that situation and cause some trouble, a la Syria, with weaponizing the Uyghurs and maybe some disgruntled Kazakhs who feel solidarity with that region in China. Now that's one reason why China would want to get involved and make sure. They ordinarily don't do stuff like that, but like you said, they're offering like joint security cooperation to prevent stuff like that happening. And then also he talks about there's some major concerns about violence erupting against the Russian minority that live in the north of the country, which there's some bubbling ethnic tensions that have mostly been alleviated in the time since Kazakhstan has been independent. And but he talks about how if that happens and you start seeing major pogroms against Russians, there could be some blowback there vis-a-vis and if the U.S. is found to be responsible for inciting problems there, that could cause some serious blowback in terms of maybe a more ethnic Russian ethnic nationalist leader taking over when Putin leaves power, which could be it could open another can of worms, as he talks about in the article. So just a very, very obviously a serious situation, and something to definitely keep an eye on, because if Victoria Nuland is the number 3 at the State Department and you've got these hawks running things, I think they see anything like this as a major opportunity, even if they're not involved right now.
All right, Connor, let's move on. We'll wrap up today's show talking about Gitmo. And the reason I want to talk about Guantanamo Bay on today's show is because January 11th, actually, the day we're recording this, marks 20 years since prisoners started arriving at the Guantanamo Bay prison. Connor, me and you both are, I guess, kind of too young to remember the opening of it. I was 11 years old at the time. I'm guessing you were a little bit younger. And so there's this really nice article at Al Jazeera, if anybody wants to look, that gives a timeline. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just, some of the opening days. November 13th, 2001, George W. Bush, the U.S. president, issues a military order on the detention, treatment, and trial of certain non-citizens in the war of terrorism. The order authorizes the U.S. to hold foreign nationals in custody without charge indefinitely and prevents them from undertaking a legal process to challenge their detention. Then we have December 28th, 2001, a memorandum of the U.S. Justice Department to the Pentagon explains that prisoners held in Guantanamo Bay are not eligible for habeas corpus rights protecting against arbitrary detention because they are not on U.S. soil. And then, of course, January 11th is the first 20 detainees arrive at Guantanamo Bay camp at X-ray and are held outdoors in wire mesh cages. There's some famous photos here. You'll see the guys in orange jumpsuits with black beds over their head, or maybe brown beds over their head, hands bound behind their backs, and they're in what looks like dog kennels, maybe slightly small dog kennels, certainly for outdoors. And that's, initially where the U.S. kept these people, literally treating them like dogs. Then one of the things I guess I remember, I don't know if, it's from 2002 or a little bit later, but I distinctly remember Dick Cheney and members of the administration talking about these being the worst of the worst. They are very dangerous. They are devoted to killing millions of Americans. And so myself at the time, being a 12-year-old boy, absolutely terrified by the rhetoric of the, Bush administration and all that, the events of 9/11, bought that and was like, well, if you gotta torture them, you gotta torture them, right? Like, you gotta keep me safe. And, I'm only 12 years old. Unfortunately, there are grown adults, and the majority of grown adults in America that were basically fine with the same thing at the time. Now, they didn't know the extent to what was going on, how much it was a torture program and everything like that. But they did know that these people are being denied rights that are even guaranteed by the Geneva Convention. The Bush administration took this tactic where they weren't like prisoners of war or anything like that, because they weren't fighting on the side of any state. And so, by the rules of our international international order that we enforce on everybody else, if you're not fighting for one of the 170 recognized or 97 recognized states, then you're fighting on the side of a non-state group, which means that the Geneva Convention doesn't apply to you. And, that's the great order that we instill upon the world. And so, there ends up being hundreds of people in Guantanamo Bay over the years. Most of them get released because they're absolutely nobodies. Some of them are low-level members of Al-Qaeda. Most of them are cases of mistaken identity, people just seeking bounties, or people whose like cousin is like a low-ranking member of Al-Qaeda, or they stayed some like coincidence level things, right? You share the same name as somebody else, and that's why they scooped you up. Now, there are a few people in Guantanamo Bay who are the worst kind of international terrorists. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who planned 9/11, is still in Guantanamo Bay. Of course, we can't really do anything with them though, because we tortured him, and any information that the U.S. got from him, it's tainted with torture, and so you can't try him in prison. That's what the great U.S. system should have shown, is that we could handle terrorism without losing our morality, and that's obviously the test that the U.S. administration failed. I feel like it's so important to talk about this week, particularly, Connor, because you have people, I forget the guy's name, who's just like now a part of Kamala Harris's press team, and everybody's upset with his tweet about immigrants. Some illegal immigrant was on MSNBC. This is years and years ago. And he was like, oh, somebody should call ICE on them, which is, or by today's standards, obviously like completely unacceptably racist. But, when you were in 2010, you could be a liberal and do that kind of thing with no pushback whatsoever. Interesting how fast some of the culture and, standards change. But also, you have Dick Cheney, the avowed torturer, the man who wanted this more than probably anyone other than maybe the psychiatrist that profited off of it. And he's being applauded in the Congress. They love him. He should be in jail. He is the worst kind of war criminal, a torturer. They sexually tortured people. They all kinds of force feeding. They say that when they force feed, they shove the tube up your nose. They lubed it up with hot sauce. They shoved things up people's anuses. They
psychological torture with anti-malaria drugs and putting people through essentially torture combined with like bad acid trip kind of MK Ultra style torture.
Yes, like one of the things that they did, I'm fairly certain, to Abu Zubaydah is they were putting him in a coffin, and then they found out he was afraid of buds, so they put him in a coffin filled with buds. He actually is getting 100,000 euros, which comes out to roughly $113,000 from Lithuania, because some of his torture happened there. While it's easy to talk about Guantanamo Bay, and some people know about Cobalt, and people are more familiar with Abu Ghraib or Kambuka in Iraq as known torture prisons, the U.S., during the Bush administration after 9/11 was picking up people for just being Muslim, for just being Arabs, flying them to torture prisons all over the world and doing horrific things to them. I can't imagine what it would be like to be some like Yemeni guy, right? And you're driving along, somebody pits you up, tortures a confession out of you, turns you over to the United States, which, if you know anything about it, it's supposed to be the worldwide center of justice. And the United States keeps you like you have no idea where in the world you actually are. You have a bag over your head, the windows are blocked out, you're naked, you're chained to the ceiling, your toes barely touch the ground. I mean, these are the situations that we put countless people in, and there has been no accountability in the United States at any level for this. Like the people who profited off of this haven't even had their money taken back. It's unbelievable, and it's the greatest outrage. And of course, I guess I take it a little bit more personally, Connor, because this is the kind of thing as a child I was scared into believing needed to happen. And so I really, really hate the people who did that. There's great op-eds all over the place. We'll be writing them at antiwar.com all week, I'm sure. This one at the LA Times is by somebody who represented members of Guantanamo Bay, a lot of them, just completely innocent people. This titled, "The First Prisoners Arrived at Guantanamo Bay 20 years ago. Will it ever close?" Of course, the answer is likely no. In 2020, we're a full decade past Obama signing a thing saying that we are definitely going to close Guantanamo Bay at the end of the year. That would have been 2010 going into 2011. They're actually spending $4 million building new facilities at Guantanamo Bay this year. This one is by a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay, Khalid Qassem. "I've been held at Guantanamo Bay for 20 years without trial. Mr. Biden, please free me." This guy is still there. He's one of the first detainees. He talks about like how terrible the whole thing is. But one of the things, this guy, if you're watching the video, you can see he does some art and, has a fair amount of talent at it. It's not like far better than anything I could do. And they even like tear up and don't let him like give his art to his lawyers to be published and all that, even though like he's had an art expose at some U.S. colleges and everything like that. So pretty horrible, but another good insight threat to what's happening. And then the last one I want to mention that I thought was really good, titled "An Enduring Symbol of the Savagery Unleashed Upon Innocent Muslims." And this one, not looking at so much from somebody tied to Gitmo, but just overall how it's perceived in the Muslim community. I believe this is the article. No, it's not. There's another one, Al Jazeera, that's fantastic, Connor, that discusses the child of one of the Guantanamo Bay detainees. He's now 18 years old, and he was conceived, his father was arrested, and then he was born. And so himself and his father have physically never touched each other, right? After 18 years, because his father's been held in a prison. He's completely innocent, but, hasn't gotten out. The kid talks about how, like, for a long time, he believed his own dad had to be guilty of something because the United States said so. And it wasn't until he talked to Clive Stafford Smith, who, really helped him to understand what was going on, but also, talked about how that, he was trying to understand what happened to his father. And in the course of that, he watched all these videos on torture and just all the kind of trauma that this kid found himself in, trying to understand what the United States is doing to his father. The last quick thing I'll mention on Gitmo, Connor, and then you say anything you got, is that The Guardian is reporting that even though the U.S. lets people out of Guantanamo Bay, and even if they're innocent, now, look, politically, I do kind of get that there's a difficult thing letting somebody out of Guantanamo Bay, because if you let them out and then they go do something, and look, maybe they weren't even terrorists before you put them in there, but you tortured them for 10 years, you shoved things, up their ass, and you had women menstruate on them, or at least the women said they were menstruating on them, and then they go and like do something crazy and kill a bunch of civilians. Doesn't seem like that absurd of a scenario, right? You could imagine this kind of thing happening, not to, say all these people are ticking time bombs or anything, but there is that legal consequence. But anyway, so the way that these people get let out of Gitmo is often by transferring them to another country, where at times they call it like a program to, like, get used to living in the world or something again, but they end up just in prison. And so 30% of them are sent to countries where they don't have a legal status and end up in jail. And one particular detainee says that he's actually in a worse prison now in the UAE than he was in Guantanamo Bay. And so the US is putting people even in worse positions of injustice here. And I don't know, that's why I got on Gitmo, Connor. Anything you got before we wrap up here?
No, I think you said it all. It's incredible that so much of this was done, like, as Scott Horton points out in Fool's Errand and enough already, that they let Bin Laden and Zawahiri go, probably deliberately. I mean, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence there, and then they just have this show gulag. A big part of it was just stretching the limits of this unitary executive theory that Cheney had, basically making the executive branch into a dictatorship, and the American people. A big part of Gitmo was in convincing people like you and me when we were kids that these people are such a threat that you have to torture them, and and I'm not saying your parents did or mine, but the idea is, like, our society supports torturing people and treating them like worse than you would treat animals, in order to convince you of how afraid you should be and how you should just go to the movies and go to the mall and let us just kill whoever we want, to spend however much money we want, because you should always be afraid. And that's why we do the dark side stuff, like Cheney would say, and the idea is, like, that's what's keeping us safe. It's the most disgusting thing in the world. And the fact that the American people have still not insisted on closing Gitmo is shameful. I mean, it's such a crime. And that's one of the things about democracy, is that as much as libertarians, and we like to get into the semantics of we aren't the government and this sort of thing. That's true, but at the same time, when policies like this happen and then nobody does anything about it, it's on all of our shoulders and it's all of our responsibility.
All right, Connor, thanks so much for coming back and doing another show. I'm sure we'll be back next week, maybe with more Iran news, maybe with something else. Everybody, just share the show, Libertarian Institute, usually on the blog at antiwar.com. And, donate, share, subscribe, rate, review, whatever you could do to help the show. Connor Freeman's Mind 96 on Twitter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ and the show is at Con _ interest. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you.